Real sleepwalking horror, disturbing incidents you weren't meant to see. Picture this. You wake up in the middle of the night. Your feet are cold, covered in dirt. Your hands are scratched and bleeding. You're standing in your backyard holding a kitchen knife, and you have absolutely no memory of how you got there. None. It's 3:47 a.m., and the last thing you remember is going to bed at 10:30. Now here's the terrifying part. This isn't a horror movie. This isn't fiction. This happens to real people every single night all over the world. And what they do while they're asleep. Some of those things were never meant to be witnessed. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about real sleepwalking horror, the kind of disturbing incidents where people find themselves in impossible situations with no memory of how they got there. Stories of individuals who woke up covered in blood, standing over bodies, holding weapons, with entire chunks of their night just gone, erased, as if someone else had been piloting their body while they were somewhere else entirely. If you're someone who's fascinated by true stories of what the human mind is capable of when consciousness slips away, hit that subscribe button right now. And leave a like if this video helps you understand just how thin the line is between sleep and waking nightmare. Because what I'm about to tell you, it'll make you question everything you think you know about sleep. Let me tell you about Kenneth Parks. Canada, 1987. A 23-year-old man with a wife, a 5-month-old daughter, and a gambling addiction that was tearing his life apart. He'd been stealing money from work to feed his habit. He was about to be exposed. His world was collapsing around him. But here's the thing. Kenneth had a good relationship with his in-laws, Barbara and Dennis Isles. They loved him like a son. Barbara especially, she called him her gentle giant. They lived about 14 miles away from Kenneth's house in suburban Toronto. May 23, 1987. Kenneth went to bed around 1:30 a.m. after watching Saturday Night Live. Normal night. His wife beside him. His daughter asleep in the next room. Everything normal. Here's what happened next. At some point during the night, Kenneth Parks got out of bed. He walked downstairs. He got into his car. He drove 14 miles through Toronto to his in-laws' house, navigating traffic lights, turns, streets he knew by heart. He had a key to their house. He let himself in. He went upstairs to their bedroom. And then Kenneth Parks beat his father-in-law Dennis with a tire iron and strangled him unconscious. He stabbed his mother-in-law Barbara with a kitchen knife. Multiple times. 5 stab wounds to her face and head. She died. Now here's where it gets absolutely chilling. After the attack, Kenneth got back in his car. He drove to a police station. He walked inside, his hands cut to the bone from gripping the knife so hard, tendons completely severed, blood everywhere, and he said to the officers, "I think I have killed some people. My hands." He was confused, disoriented. He kept saying, "My God, I just killed 2 people. I just killed 2 people with my bare hands." The police thought he was confessing to murder. Open and shut case, right? A man walks into a police station covered in blood, saying he killed people with a clear motive. He was about to be exposed for theft, and maybe he thought his in-laws would disown him. Except, Kenneth Parks had no memory of any of it. None. He remembered going to bed. The next thing he knew, he was standing in a police station with mutilated hands, being told he'd just murdered his mother-in-law and attempted to kill his father-in-law. Now you might be thinking, come on Nick, that's just a convenient excuse. Classic criminal trying to get away with murder. And look, I get it. That's what everyone thought. The prosecution certainly thought so. But here's what most people don't realize about Kenneth Parks. He had a documented history of sleepwalking. Deep, intense sleepwalking that ran in his family. His grandfather did it. His brother did it. His sister did it. Kenneth would wake up in strange places as a child with no memory of how he got there. And on the night of the murder, something in Kenneth's brain malfunctioned. The legal case became a nightmare. Because how do you prosecute someone for murder when they were literally unconscious during the act? When there's no intent, no awareness, no conscious decision to kill. The defense brought in sleep specialists, neurologists. They ran test after test, EEG monitoring, sleep studies, psychological evaluations. And what they found was terrifying. Kenneth Parks suffered from what's called automatism, a state where the body moves and acts without conscious control. During deep sleep, the part of his brain responsible for rational thought and decision-making was completely shut down. But the part that controls motor function? Fully active. He drove a car for 14 miles while asleep. He navigated a house in the dark while asleep. He committed murder while asleep. And his brain never recorded any of it. The hippocampus, the part of your brain that forms memories, was offline. To Kenneth Parks, those hours simply don't exist. There's no repressed memory to recover. No hidden truth buried in his subconscious. It just never happened to his conscious mind. In 1988, Kenneth Parks was acquitted of murder. Not guilty. The jury believed he was genuinely asleep during the attack. The Canadian Supreme Court upheld the verdict in 1992. He walked free. Now here's where it gets really interesting and deeply disturbing. Because Kenneth Parks isn't the only one. He's not even close to being an isolated case. There are dozens of documented incidents of people committing violent, horrifying acts while sleepwalking, with absolutely no memory of what they've done. And once you start digging into these cases, you realize that the line between sleep and consciousness is far more terrifying than you ever imagined. Okay, so before we go deeper into the horror stories, and trust me, we're going down a very dark rabbit hole, you need to understand what's actually happening in the brain during these episodes. Because this isn't just random chaos. There's a mechanism at work here. A glitch in the system that turns human beings into something else entirely. When you sleep, your brain goes through different stages. You've got light sleep, deep sleep, and REM sleep, the stage where you dream. Now, most people think sleepwalking happens during dreams, right? You're acting out whatever's happening in your nightmare. Wrong. Sleepwalking happens during deep sleep. Stage 3, sometimes stage 4. This is the deepest, most restorative phase of sleep. Your brain waves slow down to these long rolling delta waves. Your body temperature drops. Your muscles relax. This is when your body does its healing work, repairing tissue, strengthening the immune system, consolidating memories. But here's the problem. In a normal brain during this stage, there's a mechanism that paralyzes your body. It's called REM atonia, though it happens in non-REM stages too. Your brain essentially sends a signal down your spinal cord that says, "Don't move. We're offline right now." In sleepwalkers, this mechanism fails. The motor cortex, the part of your brain that controls movement, becomes active while the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for decision-making, judgment, and conscious thought, stays asleep. So you have a body that can walk, grab objects, open doors, even drive cars, but there's no conscious mind guiding those actions. No judgment. No moral compass. No awareness of consequences. And here's the truly disturbing part. The limbic system, which controls emotions and instincts, can still be active. So if you go to bed angry, stressed, or afraid, those emotions can bleed into your sleepwalking episodes. You might act on feelings you'd never consciously express. Rage, fear, aggression. You become a body without a conscience. Now, most sleepwalking episodes are harmless, right? People walk around their house, maybe open the fridge, mumble some nonsense, and go back to bed. Weird but harmless. But in rare cases, very rare cases, something goes catastrophically wrong. The person doesn't just walk. They act. They respond to perceived threats that don't exist. They complete complex tasks with no memory of doing them. And sometimes they hurt people. Let me tell you about another case. Because Kenneth Parks isn't alone. Arizona, 1997. Scott Faylater, 43 years old. Successful electrical engineer. Married to his high school sweetheart, Yarmila, for 20 years. 2 kids. Active member of his church. By all accounts, a devoted husband and father. January 16, 1997. Scott and Yarmila spent a normal evening at home. They worked on pool equipment in their backyard. Their pool pump had been acting up. Around 10 p.m., Scott went to bed. Here's what happened next, according to the only witness, Scott's neighbor, who happened to look out her window at the wrong moment. She saw Scott Faylater in his backyard, wearing only his underwear, crouched over something by the pool. She watched for a moment, trying to figure out what he was doing. And then she realized he was stabbing someone. Over and over. 44 stab wounds. 44. The victim was his wife, Yarmila. But here's where it gets absolutely chilling. After stabbing her 44 times, Scott dragged Yarmila's body to the pool and held her head underwater until she drowned. Then he carefully hid the knife, his bloody clothes, and the other evidence in the wheel well of his car. He changed into clean pajamas and went back to bed. When police arrived and woke him up, Scott Faylater had no idea what they were talking about. He was confused, disoriented. He kept asking where his wife was. He seemed genuinely bewildered when they told him she was dead, that he had killed her. The prosecution said it was premeditated murder. The careful disposal of evidence, the methodical nature of the attack. These weren't the actions of someone unconscious, they argued. Scott must have been awake. He must have known what he was doing. But the defense brought in sleep specialists who told a different story. Scott Faylater had a history of sleepwalking. Not as extensive as Kenneth Parks, but documented. His family reported incidents of him walking around the house at night, completely asleep, talking to people with his eyes open, appearing awake, but with no memory of the conversations the next day. The defense argued that Scott had been in an extreme state of somnambulism, so deep in sleep that even complex behaviors could be performed automatically. The brain can execute learned behaviors, sequential tasks, even problem-solving without conscious awareness. He killed his wife of 20 years while completely asleep. And here's the part that still haunts researchers. The jury didn't buy it. Unlike Kenneth Parks, Scott Faylater was convicted of first-degree murder in 1999. He's still in prison today, serving a life sentence without parole. Why the different outcome? Because the cases were too similar to ignore, but just different enough to create doubt. Scott's actions seemed too deliberate, too careful. The hiding of evidence, the changing of clothes, it suggested consciousness, awareness. But sleep researchers to this day are divided on the case. Some believe Scott was genuinely asleep. Others think he woke up at some point during the attack and made a conscious decision to continue. The truth? We'll never know. Because Scott himself doesn't remember. The night is just gone. Now, here's what most people don't realize about these cases, and this is crucial to understanding why they're so terrifying. When someone commits an act while sleepwalking, there's a phenomenon called state-dependent memory. Basically, memories formed in one state of consciousness can't always be accessed from another state. It's why drunk people sometimes can't remember what they did while drinking, but if they get drunk again, the memories might come back. With sleepwalking, it's even more extreme. Because the hippocampus, the part of the brain that encodes memories, is essentially offline. The person isn't just forgetting what happened. The memory is never formed in the first place. It's not buried or repressed. It simply doesn't exist. Imagine that for a second. Imagine waking up and being told you did something horrific, but you have no memory of it. Not a fuzzy memory. Not a vague recollection. Nothing. As far as your conscious mind is concerned, you went to sleep and then woke up. Everything in between is just blank. That's the reality for people like Kenneth Parks and Scott Faylater. They're confronted with physical evidence, blood on their hands, bodies, witnesses, but to them, it might as well have been committed by someone else. Because in a very real sense, it was. The person who committed those acts wasn't the conscious, aware individual. It was something else. A body without a mind. Now you might be thinking, okay Nick, but these are rare cases, right? This doesn't happen often. And you'd be right. Violent sleepwalking is extremely rare. Most sleepwalkers never hurt anyone. They wander around, maybe open cupboards, have weird conversations, and go back to bed. But here's the thing, we don't know how rare it actually is. Because most sleepwalking episodes go unwitnessed. They happen in the privacy of someone's home in the dead of night, with no one around to see them. People wake up with scratches they don't remember getting, bruises in strange places, objects moved around their house, and they just shrug it off. But what if something worse happened? What if there was a near miss that no one witnessed? How many cases of sleepwalking violence go unreported because the person doesn't realize what they almost did? Let me tell you about a case that illustrates this perfectly. England, 2005. A mother, I'll call her Rachel because her identity was protected in court documents, woke up one morning to find bruises on her young daughter's neck. The little girl, only 4 years old, said mommy had hurt her during the night. Rachel had no memory of it. None. She'd gone to bed like any other night, exhausted from a long day of work and parenting. The next thing she knew, it was morning and her daughter was crying, pointing at the marks on her neck. Rachel took her daughter to the doctor, terrified. Had someone broken into their house? Had her ex-husband somehow gotten in and hurt the child? The doctor examined the bruises and determined they were consistent with strangulation. Someone had tried to choke this little girl. Police were called. Rachel was questioned. She maintained she had no memory of the incident, but the evidence was damning. She was the only adult in the house. The doors were locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry. Rachel was charged with attempted murder of her own child. But here's where the story takes a turn. Rachel's lawyer did something smart. He dug into her medical history. And he found something. Rachel had been sleepwalking since childhood. She'd had episodes where she'd wake up in different rooms, sometimes even outside her house. Her family had stories of her doing strange things at night, cooking meals, rearranging furniture, having entire conversations all while asleep. But she'd never hurt anyone before. The lawyer brought in sleep specialists who conducted overnight studies. They monitored Rachel's brain activity while she slept. And what they found was disturbing. During deep sleep, Rachel exhibited violent movements. She thrashed. She grabbed at invisible objects. Her face contorted with anger or fear. Emotions her conscious mind wasn't experiencing because she was asleep. At one point during the study, she actually got out of bed and made aggressive gestures toward the monitoring equipment, her eyes open but vacant, completely unresponsive to the researchers trying to wake her. The diagnosis: parasomnia with violent automatism. Essentially, Rachel's brain was acting out aggressive scenarios while she slept, and her body was following those commands. The court accepted the defense. Rachel was acquitted, but with conditions. She had to take medication to suppress her deep sleep stages, and her daughter had to live with relatives until Rachel's condition was considered stable. Imagine being Rachel. Imagine waking up every night wondering, am I going to hurt someone I love? Will tonight be the night I do something I can't take back? That's the psychological horror of sleepwalking violence. It's not just the act itself, it's the knowledge that you're capable of it. That somewhere inside your brain, there's a version of you with no conscience, no judgment, no control. And you never know when it might take over. Okay, so here's where things get really interesting and disturbing. Because as researchers have studied these cases over the past few decades, they've started to notice patterns. Commonalities between people who commit violent acts while sleepwalking. First, sleep deprivation. Almost every single case of violent sleepwalking involves someone who hasn't been sleeping properly for days, weeks, or even months. Kenneth Parks had been suffering from severe insomnia due to his gambling debts and work stress. Scott Faylater had been working overtime on projects. Rachel had been dealing with single parenthood and working long shifts. When you're sleep deprived, your brain's mechanisms start to fail. The systems that normally keep you paralyzed during sleep become less reliable. The prefrontal cortex, already shut down during deep sleep, becomes even more disconnected from reality. Second, stress and trauma. Nearly every violent sleepwalker was dealing with extreme psychological pressure. Relationship problems. Work stress. Childhood trauma. The brain's stress response can bleed into sleep, creating scenarios where the person acts out their anxieties or fears. Kenneth Parks was about to lose everything. Scott Faylater was under pressure at work. Rachel was struggling as a single mother. The stress doesn't cause sleepwalking, but it can trigger violent episodes in people who are already prone to parasomnia. Third, family history. This is the one that researchers find most consistent. Sleepwalking has a strong genetic component. If your parents sleepwalked, you're much more likely to do it. If your siblings do it, your risk increases even more. It's as if some families have a broken switch in their sleep mechanisms. A vulnerability that gets passed down through generations, waiting for the right circumstances to activate. Now, here's the terrifying question that researchers still can't answer. How many people have this vulnerability and don't know it? How many people are walking around with the same genetic markers, the same brain patterns, who've just never been pushed to the breaking point? You might be one of them. You might go your whole life never knowing you're capable of sleepwalking until one night, after a week of bad sleep, after a traumatic event, after too much stress, your brain glitches, and you become someone else. Let me tell you about one more case, because this one is different. This one shows just how complex and horrifying sleepwalking violence can be. Jules Lowe, England, 2005. A 32-year-old father who'd been having problems with his 82-year-old father, Edward. They'd been arguing about Edward's care. Edward had dementia and was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Jules had been losing sleep, stressed out of his mind, trying to figure out how to help his father while managing his own life. One night, Jules stayed over at his father's house to keep an eye on him. He fell asleep on the couch, and then he killed his father. Jules beat Edward Lowe to death with his bare hands. 90 separate injuries. Blunt force trauma to the head. Broken bones. Edward died of his injuries. When Jules woke up, he found his father's body and immediately called the police, hysterical. He had no memory of the attack. None. He couldn't believe he'd done it. The prosecution argued it was murder motivated by frustration and caregiver stress. Jules had snapped, killed his father in a rage, and then pretended not to remember. But here's what made this case different. Jules Lowe had no prior history of sleepwalking. None. No childhood episodes, no family history, nothing that would suggest he was prone to parasomnia. So what happened? The defense brought in sleep specialists who proposed something terrifying: stress-induced parasomnia. The theory is that extreme psychological trauma or stress can trigger sleepwalking episodes even in people who've never experienced them before. The brain, overwhelmed by pressure, essentially short-circuits during sleep. Jules Lowe was acquitted of murder but found guilty of manslaughter. The jury believed he hadn't been fully conscious during the attack, but they couldn't completely accept that he was asleep. He was sentenced to 2 years in a psychiatric facility. Now, here's what haunts researchers about this case. If Jules Lowe had no history of sleepwalking, if he'd never shown any signs of parasomnia before, what triggered it that night? Was it the stress? The sleep deprivation? Some underlying brain abnormality that had never been activated before? And if it can happen to Jules Lowe, can it happen to anyone? That's the question that keeps sleep researchers up at night. Because if stress alone can trigger violent sleepwalking in someone with no prior history, then the potential pool of people at risk is massive. Anyone dealing with extreme stress, anyone going through trauma, anyone losing sleep, they could all be vulnerable. You could be vulnerable. Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. Because I know what you're thinking. Nick, if people can commit murder while sleepwalking and get away with it, isn't that a massive loophole? Can't anyone just claim they were asleep? And look, I get it. It sounds like the perfect defense, right? I didn't do it, I was asleep. How convenient. But here's the thing. The sleepwalking defense almost never works. Out of dozens of cases where it's been tried, only a handful have resulted in acquittals. Kenneth Parks is the exception, not the rule. Most juries don't buy it. Most prosecutors tear the defense apart. The burden of proof is incredibly high. You need documented history of sleepwalking. You need sleep studies showing abnormal brain activity. You need expert testimony from neurologists and sleep specialists. You need to demonstrate that the act was completely out of character for you, something you'd never do while conscious. And even then, it's a gamble. Scott Faylater had a sleepwalking history. He had expert witnesses. He still got convicted of first-degree murder. But here's the deeper philosophical question. If someone commits an act while genuinely unconscious, are they responsible? Think about it. Responsibility requires intent, right? You can't be held accountable for something you didn't choose to do, something you had no control over. If your body acts without your conscious mind being involved, are you really the one who did it? This is where the law gets messy. Because legally, we recognize that people can act without intent. That's why we have different degrees of murder, manslaughter, and accidental death. The law understands that not all killing is equal. But sleepwalking violence is different. Because the person's body committed the act. Their hands held the weapon. Their muscles performed the movements. In every physical sense, they did it. But their mind, their consciousness, their sense of self, was somewhere else. Offline. Absent. So who's responsible? The body? The subconscious? The brain malfunction? Researchers don't have a good answer to this. And honestly, I don't either. But I'll tell you what really terrifies me about these cases. The victims. Because whether or not the sleepwalker is legally responsible, someone still died. Someone's mother, father, spouse, child, they're still gone. The trauma to the families is real, regardless of the killer's mental state. Barbara Isles, Kenneth Parks' mother-in-law, died in her own home, killed by someone she loved and trusted. Yarmila Faylater was murdered by her husband of 20 years. Edward Lowe was beaten to death by his own son. Their deaths are no less tragic because the killer was asleep. Here's something most people don't think about. What happens to the sleepwalker after they're acquitted? Kenneth Parks walked free, but his life was destroyed. He killed the woman who loved him like a son. His wife stood by him, but the marriage eventually fell apart. He struggled with guilt, depression, anxiety. Even though he had no memory of the act, he knew he'd done it. His hands had committed murder. How do you live with that? How do you go to sleep every night knowing what your body is capable of? Knowing that somewhere inside your brain, there's a mechanism that can turn you into a killer? Kenneth Parks became obsessed with preventing another episode. He took medication to suppress his deep sleep. He installed alarms on his doors and windows. He had his wife tie his leg to the bed with a rope every night so he couldn't get up. Imagine living like that. Imagine being so afraid of yourself that you have to be physically restrained while you sleep. That's the aftermath of sleepwalking violence. Even if you're acquitted, even if everyone accepts you were unconscious, you still have to live with the knowledge of what you did. The physical evidence is undeniable. The consequences are permanent. And the fear never goes away. Rachel, the mother who strangled her daughter, was acquitted but lost custody of her child. She takes heavy medication every night, drugs that alter her brain chemistry to prevent deep sleep. She hasn't had a full night's natural sleep in over 15 years. The medication has side effects: memory problems, mood swings, weight gain. But she takes it anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. Jules Lowe served his time in the psychiatric facility and was released, but he's never recovered from killing his father. He attempted suicide twice. He can't hold down a job. He's estranged from the rest of his family, who blame him for Edward's death even though he was legally not responsible. These people are trapped in a nightmare they can't wake up from. Because even though they were unconscious during the acts, they have to live with the consequences every single day for the rest of their lives. That's the true horror of sleepwalking violence. Not just the act itself, but the endless aftermath. Okay, so after hearing all these stories, you're probably wondering, Nick, how do I know if I'm at risk? Are there warning signs? The answer is yes, but they're subtle and most people ignore them. First, If you have a history of sleepwalking, especially if it runs in your family, you're at higher risk. Not for violence necessarily, but for parasomnia episodes. Pay attention to what your body does at night. Do you wake up in strange places? Do people tell you that you talk or move around while asleep? Second, sleep deprivation is a massive trigger. If you're consistently getting less than 6 hours of sleep a night, your brain's safety mechanisms start to fail. The longer you go without proper rest, the higher your risk of parasomnia. Third, stress and anxiety can trigger episodes. If you're going through a traumatic period in your life, divorce, job loss, financial problems, grief, your brain is more vulnerable to glitches during sleep. Fourth, alcohol and certain medications can increase sleepwalking risk. Sedatives, some antidepressants, and drugs that alter sleep architecture can disrupt the brain's normal patterns. If you're experiencing multiple risk factors at once, family history, sleep deprivation, high stress, you need to be careful. Talk to a sleep specialist. Get a proper evaluation. Don't wait until something goes wrong. Because here's the thing. Most people who commit violent acts while sleepwalking never thought it could happen to them. Kenneth Parks had sleepwalked his whole life without hurting anyone. Rachel had been a peaceful sleepwalker for decades before she nearly killed her daughter. There's no way to predict when a sleepwalking episode will turn violent. No warning sign that says, "Tonight's the night you'll do something you can't take back." The glitch can happen at any time. As I've researched these cases, what strikes me most is how little we actually understand about sleep. We spend a third of our lives unconscious, our brains doing things we can't control or remember, and we still don't fully understand why it happens or how to prevent it from going wrong. We don't know why some people's brains fail to paralyze their bodies during sleep. We don't know why stress triggers violent episodes in some people but not others. We don't know how to predict who's at risk. And here's the really disturbing part. We're all at risk. Every single person who sleeps has the potential for their brain to malfunction. It's rare, yes, but it's possible. You go to bed every night trusting that your brain will do what it's supposed to do, that the mechanisms keeping you safe will work, that you'll wake up in the same place you fell asleep, with no blood on your hands, no consequences to face. But what if one night they don't? What if tonight is the night your brain glitches? What if the stress you've been carrying, the sleep you've been losing, the genetics you inherited, what if they all converge into the perfect storm? What would you do while you're asleep? That's the question that haunts me. Because the truth is you don't know. None of us do. Our conscious minds aren't in control when we sleep. We're passengers in our own bodies, hoping the autopilot doesn't malfunction. And sometimes it does. Look, here's what I want you to understand. I'm not telling you these stories to scare you for no reason. I'm not trying to make you afraid to sleep. But I think it's important to recognize the truth about consciousness. We like to think we're in control. That we're the captains of our own ships, making deliberate choices, responsible for every action we take. But the reality is far more fragile than that. Your consciousness is a thin layer sitting on top of ancient, primal systems that don't care about your morals or your intentions. Your brain can betray you. Your body can act without your permission. And when that happens, when the mechanisms fail, the consequences are real. Lives are destroyed. People die. Families are torn apart. Kenneth Parks didn't want to kill his mother-in-law. Scott Faylater didn't want to murder his wife. Rachel didn't want to hurt her daughter. Jules Lowe didn't want to beat his father to death. But they did. Their bodies did. And now they have to live with that for the rest of their lives, even though they were unconscious during the acts. That's the horror of sleepwalking violence. Not just the physical acts, but the existential terror of realizing you're not always in control of yourself. That there's a version of you, a version without conscience, without memory, without humanity, that can take over at any moment. And you'll never see it coming. So tonight, when you go to bed, think about this. Who will you be while you're asleep? What will your body do while your conscious mind is somewhere else? For most of us, the answer is nothing. We'll sleep peacefully, wake up refreshed, and never know what our brains did in the dark hours. But for some people, people who never thought it could happen to them, the answer is something else entirely. Something they'll never remember. Something they can never take back. Real sleepwalking horror isn't about demons or supernatural forces. It's about the realization that the scariest monster isn't outside your window or hiding in your closet. It's inside your own brain. And it's just waiting for the right moment to wake up. If this video made you think differently about sleep, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the dark side of human psychology. And leave a comment telling me, have you ever experienced sleepwalking? Have you ever woken up somewhere you didn't expect to be? Because you might be closer to these stories than you think. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about the disturbing incidents that happen when consciousness slips away. Sleep well tonight, if you can.